In the winter of 1637, a man in Amsterdam traded away an entire luxury canal-side mansion, not for gold, not for land, not for a fleet of ships, for this, a flower bulb. One single flower bulb that was, at that exact moment, buried underground, in the dirt, where nobody could even see it. Let me put that in numbers your brain can actually feel. A single bulb of the most famous flower, the Semper Augustus, sold for around 5,000 guilders. The average skilled worker, a carpenter, a guy with an actual job, made about 150 guilders a year. So this onion was worth roughly 33 years of human labor. You could buy a townhouse, a carriage, the horses to pull it, and have enough left over to never work again. Or a flower that dies. Here's the thing though, we love to think speculative bubbles are a modern disease. Crypto, meme stocks, that one cousin who put his rent into Dogecoin. But 400 years before any of that, with no internet, no apps, and no Twitter to scream diamond hands into, the Dutch invented the financial bubble from scratch. They built FOMO, futures contracts, and a total economic meltdown over gardening. This is Tulip Mania, history's dumbest financial bubble. And honestly, it's also one of its most human. Here a mag. To understand the madness, you have to understand that in the 1600s, the Netherlands was absolutely loaded. This was the Dutch Golden Age. While the rest of Europe was busy stabbing each other over religion, the Dutch built the most powerful trading machine on earth. They basically invented modern capitalism. The stock market, the Dutch, the first multinational mega corporation, also the Dutch, but that's a whole other video. The point is, this tiny swamp country became the richest place in the world per person, and that created a brand new problem. A very familiar problem. New money. A massive class of merchants who suddenly had piles of cash and absolutely no old money pedigree to go with it. Here's the problem when you get rich fast. You need a way to flex. You need to signal to everyone that you've made it. Today, that's a Lambo, a Rolex, or a verified checkmark. Back then, a flower. Enter the tulip. The tulip wasn't even European. It came all the way from the Ottoman Empire, imported through Turkey, which made it instantly exotic. And exotic meant expensive. Exotic meant nobody else had one. The tulip became the single hottest status symbol in the country. If you had a rare tulip blooming in your garden, you weren't just a guy with a flower. You were a guy with taste. You were rich, cultured, and superior. It was the 17th century equivalent of parking a brand new Ferrari in your driveway. Except the Ferrari had to be watered and could be eaten by a slug. But not all tulips were created equal. A plain red tulip was nice. A plain yellow tulip was fine. But the ones that drove people insane were the ones with wild, flickering, flame-like patterns streaking up the petals. Reds and whites tangled together, like someone had splashed paint on fire. The crown jewel was the Semper Augustus, white petals slashed with ribbons of deep red, like a flag painted by a lightning strike. People lost their minds over it. So why was it worth a mansion? Here's where it gets gross. And amazing. Those beautiful flame patterns? They weren't a feature. They were a disease. The streaks were caused by something we now call the tulip-breaking virus. It was a plant infection, essentially a flower STD, spread by aphids. The virus messed with the bulb's pigment, breaking the solid color into those random, gorgeous flame patterns. So let me explain the value here. A. Sick. The flower was worth 100 times more than a healthy one. And here's the part that turned a luxury good into a financial nuclear bomb. The virus was completely random. Nobody understood how it worked. You couldn't manufacture it. You couldn't predict it. You couldn't mass produce a Semper Augustus because the very thing that made it valuable was an uncontrollable infection you had no way to copy. This is the iron law of value, the one that runs every bubble in history. Extreme scarcity creates extreme price. When something is genuinely rare, beautiful, and impossible to reproduce, humans go feral. Think of the Semper Augustus as the original one-of-one NFT, or a Rolex with a typo on the dial that they'll never print again. It wasn't valuable because it was useful. It was valuable because you couldn't have one. And that, somehow, made everyone want one more. There were maybe a dozen true Semper Augustus bulbs in the entire country. A dozen. For a nation of newly rich people, desperate to outflex each other. The math was about to get really, really stupid. Now we hit a biological speed bump. Tulips are divas. They only bloom for about a week in spring, and you can only safely dig up and move the bulb in the summer, when it's dormant basically, when the plant is asleep. So for most of the year, the most valuable object in the country was just sitting underground. Invisible, untouchable. You couldn't trade it because you literally couldn't dig it up without killing it. For a country full of obsessive capitalists, this was unacceptable. They had money to spend now. They had FOMO now. But the product wouldn't be available for months. So they did the most Dutch thing imaginable. They invented a way to trade flowers that didn't exist yet. They called it the wind handle, the wind trade, because you were trading nothing but air. And what they accidentally invented in those smoky taverns was one of the most powerful financial tools on earth, the futures contract. Okay, let's break this down. Let's say you're 5 years old. There's this kid. We'll call him Pim. Pim really wants the new toy that comes out next summer. But it's winter, and the toy isn't in stores yet. So Pim walks up to the toy maker and says,
"Here's the deal. I'll promise to pay you 10 coins next summer, and you promise to give me that toy when it's ready."
Write it on a piece of paper, and they shake hands. Boom. That paper is a futures contract. It's not the toy. It's a promise about the toy. A promise you can hold, save, or sell to someone else. Because here's what happens. The toy gets super popular before it's even released. Now, everybody wants one. So Pim sells his little promise paper for 20 coins to another kid. That kid sells it to another for 40. That kid sells it for 80. And not one of these children has ever actually seen the toy. The toy doesn't exist yet. They're just trading the promise. And the promise keeps getting more expensive because everyone assumes the next person will pay even more. That, my friends, is exactly what the Dutch were doing. Except swap toy for flower bulbs still asleep in the ground, and swap kids for grown adults getting hammered in a bar. A single Semper Augustus bulb might be sold 10 times over the winter, passing through 10 different owners, none of whom ever touched it. It was pure paper, pure speculation. The bulb was almost beside the point. People weren't buying flowers anymore. They were buying the bet. And when you turn an object into a bet, you don't need rich people anymore. You just need everybody. This is the moment every bubble has. The moment it stops being a rich guy hobby and becomes a national obsession. The moment your barber starts giving you flower bulb tips. By 1636, regular working people were diving in head first. Bakers, weavers, carpenters, farmers, people who had never invested in anything, were suddenly trading tulip futures in taverns every single night. And why wouldn't they? They'd watch their neighbors get rich. They'd seen a guy who fixed shoes for a living turn one contract into a year's wages in a week. The story spreading through every Dutch town was simple and intoxicating. You cannot lose. Prices stopped making sense. Between late 1636 and February 1637, some bulb prices multiplied 20-fold. Not over decades, over weeks. People weren't asking, "Is this flower worth it?" They were asking, "How much will the next idiot pay me?" Which, by the way, has an actual name. Economists call it the greater fool theory. You knowingly overpay for something garbage, betting a greater fool will buy it from you for even more. And then came the part that always ends in tears. The debt. People started mortgaging their homes, selling their tools, borrowing against their businesses. A baker would put up his entire bakery, his livelihood, his family's future to buy a paper contract for a bulb that was still buried in someone else's garden, that he had never seen, that might be infected with a virus that may or may not exist. Let me say that out loud, so it lands. People bet their houses on promises about flowers they couldn't see, that weren't grown yet, sold in bars, with no regulation, no proof, and no plan B. What could possibly go wrong? The whole thing was now balanced on a single, invisible assumption that tomorrow, somebody would always pay more than today. The entire economy was holding its breath. And in February 1637, in a tavern in Haarlem, somebody finally exhaled. February 1637, Haarlem. A routine bulb auction, the kind that had happened 1,000 times. The auctioneer holds up the lot. He names the opening price, same as always, and he waits for a bid. Nothing. He lowers the price. He asks again. Surely someone will bid. Someone always bids. Nobody. For the first time in a single moment, in a single room, the crowd looked at the flower, then looked at the price, and collectively asked the one question nobody had dared ask for 2 years. Wait, why is this worth anything at all? And that's the thing about a bubble. It doesn't run on flowers, or paper, or even money. It runs on belief. And the second belief cracks, the whole thing has nothing left to stand on. The news spread like a fire through a dry forest. By the next morning, traders in other towns heard that Harlem buyers had vanished. So, they panicked and tried to sell, which meant everyone was selling and nobody was buying, which sent prices into freefall. This is market psychology in its purest, ugliest form. The exact same emotion that inflates a bubble. Everybody's doing it. I can't miss out. Instantly flips into its evil twin. Everybody's running. Get out. FOMO becomes panic. Greed becomes terror. The herd that charged in trampling each other now stampedes for the exit, trampling each other again. Within days, bulbs that had been worth a luxury house were worth roughly the price of an onion, which is, of course, exactly what they always were. Paper fortunes evaporated overnight. The baker who mortgaged his bakery, he now owed a fortune for a contract worth nothing to buy a flower nobody wanted. So now we have a country full of furious people demanding their money. The buyers refused to pay for worthless bulbs. The sellers demanded the agreed price. It went to the courts, and the courts made a fascinating call. They essentially threw up their hands and said, "These tavern contracts aren't real business deals. They're gambling debts. You were betting in a bar, and the law doesn't enforce bar bets," which is a wild detail when you think about it. The legal system officially ruled that the entire tulip market had been one giant casino, not investing, gambling. The contracts were declared unenforceable. Deals were settled for pennies, and everyone limped home to count their losses and never, ever speak of it again. Now, historians will tell you tulip mania probably didn't crash the whole Dutch economy. It wasn't the apocalypse, some legends claim. But that misses the real point. The real point isn't economic. It's that this keeps happening forever. Because every single bubble runs the exact same script. A genuinely cool new thing appears. Smart early people make real money. The story spreads. You can't lose. Regular people pile in with borrowed money. Prices detach completely from reality. And then, one ordinary day, in one ordinary room, somebody simply doesn't buy, and the whole cathedral of belief comes down at once. We love to laugh at the Dutch. Imagine mortgaging your house for a flower. What idiots. But here's the uncomfortable part. They weren't stupid. They weren't a primitive people who didn't understand money. They had banks, stock markets, and global trade more advanced than most of the world. They had everything we have, except the apps. The tools change. The flower becomes a stock, becomes a coin, becomes whatever's next. But the wiring underneath never changes. The fear of missing out. The certainty that this time it's different. The quiet hope that there's always one more fool behind you in line. That isn't a 17th century bug. It's a permanent feature of the human brain. So the next time someone tells you about a can't miss, get rich quick, everybody's doing it opportunity that only ever goes up, just remember, a country of brilliant, sophisticated people who once bet their entire lives on a sick flower, sleeping in the dirt. Technology evolves. Greed is forever.